Hi, I'm Steve Plach, and I'll be your host for this segment of Voices from the Village. Tonight's show is entitled Water Pressure. We're going to be talking about water, our current water supply, the future of our water supply in Santa Cruz, one of the truly hot-button items in town and one of the great challenges for our future. In October of 2013, the City Council directed staff to develop a plan to engage the community in an examination of water supply issues. From that direction, the Water Supply Advisory Committee was born. There are 14 members on the committee who represent broad community interests, including the environment, business, education, and the Water Commission. I'm very pleased to have with me tonight a good friend and a member of WASAC, Rick Longinati. Rick, welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, you and I have done some things together in water advocacy and conservation back through the last few years. Give us a little bit your background, starting with desal alternatives and your engagement in the issues generally.
Okay. Well, about 2010 is when we put on our first public event inviting the water department and some other speakers who were informed about desalination, because there was a question in my mind and those of others about the energy use for desalination. Right. It's very energy intensive, about 10 times the energy per gallon of desalinated water as our current water supply. So that was my interest, because I was an electrical contractor for many years, and I tried to, you know, do the right thing for my customers and advise them on energy efficiency and stuff. So I thought, you know, 10 times the energy intensity, that's not the way to go. Let's try to find alternatives. So the focus early on was, you know, what's going on? Like, what is the need?
Right.
What was the impetus for this desalination? And what, if any, alternatives were there? So our group formed with that intention, just one simple request of the city, which was, would you reopen the process of looking at alternatives?
Right. And I can recall the first meeting, some over at Garfield Park and over at the Sentinel building, the old Sentinel building, you know, some of the first meetings where people would really engage on these issues. It's fascinating kind of how that came together and where it went from there.
Well, yeah, I mean, although it was a simple request, it wasn't, you know, as welcomely received as you might imagine, because there was a whole momentum of expenditures and studies and whatnot, amounting to ultimately $15 million worth of studies, that you know, people weren't ready to put on the brakes and say, well, okay, now let's look at alternatives. No, we did that. That was the response we got. We did that, and desalination is the only one that we came up with that would fill the bill. Well, we said, well, wait a minute. We said, you know, for one thing, you know, people are more aware about the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on our climate.
Question,
and that we, you know, back when the desalination was first conceived, that wasn't quite as prevalent in the public mind. And the other main issue that had changed in between the time that they conceived the idea of desalination was that our water demand in the Santa Cruz service area, which includes the city and Live Oak, it dropped dramatically. It dropped by about 25% in a short space of time, about a 10-year period. What that meant is that the original reason to have desalination, which was to protect us during drought years, that actually was no longer the reason. That reason disappeared because water demand went so far down that we, even in the worst case drought year, were able to satisfy the city and water users with the current water supply.
And what struck me during that period of time was the water department's resistance to water transfers, water neutral development, excess storage capacity, things that the desal alternative was suggesting at that time, that the water department seemed to reject out of hand, said, nope, you know, we have our mandate from the city council. They want us to build a desal plant, so that's what we're going to do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there wasn't a real openness at the time to look at alternatives, and understandably because of the momentum, right?
Of course.
You know, you got to stop the train before you can turn it to another. So,
or just press pause, as you often suggested, right?
So I want to clarify just the last point about the need, though. So,
please.
So the original need for desalination was expressed in terms of our shortfall in a worst case drought year. So the worst case drought on record was 1977.
I recall that,
And they have the computer model, which models, what would happen if that drought happened again, the same kind of conditions in the streams and rainfall and so on. What they found was in 2003, our demand at the time would be 45% greater than the supply. There's this huge gap.
Wow, that's quite a disparity. Yeah.
So in other words, people would have to cut back by 45%. And so that was the reason for the proposed desalination. That went down to zero shortfall,
Right.
according to the recent calculation by the same consultant.
Right.
So now there's a new consideration of why we may be short in drought years, and that's that not only has demand gone down, but our supply has gone down, or it's about to go down, on the basis of having to leave more water in the streams for fish.
For fish, of course, yeah.
So the city is under pressure to conform to the Endangered Species Act.
Hence the name of our show, Water Pressure. But I think that people have overcomplicated to a certain extent over the past few years is it's basically a supply and demand equation. You have to have the supply to meet the demand. And also, I think one thing that was really not pointed out about a drought of the 76, 77 type is a once in a 60 or a 90 year occurrence. So that that was what was said, and I think that's right. But after the desal alternatives was formed, and then of course the city continued on the path, the water department continued on the path toward building the desal plant, and that's when the right to vote on the desal coalition was formed. You and I were some of the founding members of that, and went out into the community and gathered enough signatures, put it on the ballot, and of course that was successful in giving the people of Santa Cruz a right to vote on the construction of a desal plant, as you recall.
Right. Well, we have the initiative process available to citizens in California, and in this case, it was a good thing we did because we wanted to put the decision in the hands of the voters.
Right.
And 73% of the electorate voted in favor of giving themselves the right to decide about desalination. That changed everything in terms of the city's receptivity to our request.
Of course, yeah.
And people like Fred Keeley, helped the city see clearly that politically desalination was not going to win at the ballot box. So the city realized that and decided to press the pause button, as we had asked, and to open up a process to consider alternatives. And that's where we are at now, with 10 months into this process with 14 members, including, as you said, business folks, environmentalists.
Yeah, it's quite the eclectic group. I was looking on the website, we had David Stearns and Sue Holt, a lot of different people, David Baskin, yourself, Mike Rotkin, Sarah Manser from Surf Riders. So it's a terrific group. We have a lot of people who have different, I think, approaches to water and water supply and the complexities that exist. I think the vote on the right to vote on desal coalition and the vote subsequent to that was really a watershed event for not only the community but for the water department as well, when they realized, oh, wait a minute, maybe there are things that we should be considering. And so, as I noted, in October of 2013, this commission was put together. Were those direct appointments from Hillary Bryant, the mayor at that time? Is that how that worked?
There was a committee of 3 council members.
Okay.
Yeah, who appointed them.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's a great group.
Yeah.
And what I think everybody in the group is really open to looking at alternatives. There's no preconceived ideas about what our conclusion is going to be. I think there's a great deal of openness.
So tell us about after the formation, the process you had to go through, the things that really you had to set the foundation for before you could really look at serious water supply options for the future.
Yeah. Well, this kind of committee is not something that we're used to here in Santa Cruz, and probably most places. We have a professional facilitator who encouraged us in our decision-making process to go by consensus.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's pretty foreign territory for most of us.
Yeah.
How do we come to consensus on things? Well, there's a safety catch, which is if we're not able to reach consensus, there's a 10 vote out of 14 supermajority that can pass something. Well, even that's enormous, supermajority. So it changes the whole dynamic. You know, it's like I'm not just looking for another vote to make it, you know, a majority. I'm trying to, you know, persuade the whole committee, and they're trying to persuade me. It makes for a better dialogue. And you know, I think that we don't always appreciate how kind of revolutionary this is. If it's successful, I think it could be a great model for other difficult issues that the community has to deal with.
And certainly, I think it's a terrific model for any community that's wrestling with a crucial issue that water is for us, and I'm certain it is in other municipalities. But here, it's been especially, I think, important to people and on their minds. I think of the things that people consider the most important challenges of the city, certainly water supply is one of them. I'll tell you kind of as an anecdote, you were talking about the consensus process. I was involved, as you know, with Occupy Santa Cruz, and that was my first experience with the consensus process. And the process around the consensus process, which was just, you know, excruciating at times to be able to get through, but I think it is a terrific way to reach for decision making. And I think once you kind of adjust your thinking to that it's not a vertical structure, it's a horizontal structure, you say, okay, well, that works pretty well. So I know that in October of last year, you had a convention. I think it was at the Civic, and I've seen the video clips of that. You brought in lots of people who had for their suggestions of what can we do to secure our water future? What can we do to maintain water supply so that our water supply meets the demand? Tell us about a few of the suggestions that people had made in that process.
Well, I mean, this was another aspect of our operation that was really unprecedented, from what I can tell, is that the city staff, who normally engages a professional engineering consultant to come up with, well, okay, what are the alternatives, study those alternatives in terms of their cost, their feasibility, how much they would yield. We have those experts staffing the committee, but they're not the ones that are suggesting the ideas.
Hold on a sec, Rick.
Yeah.
Do we have a call? No. Okay. I'm sorry, Rick, but I hasten to say that this is a live call-in show. People may want to call and talk and ask a question of you. So 425-8848, 425-8848, extension 30. People can call in and ask our very knowledgeable guest any questions.
Yeah. So what I was saying was that so you have an engineering staff, but they didn't suggest the alternatives that we're looking at. The alternatives were suggested by the community. So and this was our water director's idea to have this convention. So it opened it up to the community, and there are a number of knowledgeable people in the community,
of course,
you know, engineers and environmental groups and so on, who suggested, you know, over 60 ideas. So then it becomes a process of evaluating those ideas, and that's where we're at now. We're finally at the point where we can kind of take those ideas seriously because we have enough information about them, and to see which ones might work. And actually, I want to invite people to come to the next Water Supply Advisory Committee meeting, which is March 18th at 5 p.m. At the Peace United Church, and also the Friday, which is the March 20th at 2 p.m. at the same place. So this is the time when those ideas are going to be, you know, have been funneled into the committee, are going to be evaluated at that meeting.
Now, when you're doing the evaluations as a committee member, you have technical staff support of some kind. Obviously, there are people who are knowledgeable of water engineers and water supply technicians, people who know. I know that during the desal period, when they were working on the desal plant proposals, they had a lot of very technical white papers that were drafted by people who were obviously very knowledgeable in those areas. You have people similar to that?
I mean, the city is spending serious money
Yeah.
on consultants, in addition to the engineers and so on who are on the staff of the water department already. So we have a lot of technical support, and including people that are looking into, you know, how do you recharge groundwater, or there's a quarry on the North Coast that used to belong to the Cemex company that owned the cement plant in Davenport.
Yeah.
Well, the current owner has offered that to the city as a potential reservoir, and without a dam or anything, you could store 650 million gallons. Well, the engineer is looking into, is that feasible? You know, could it support a reservoir? One of the main ideas that's been developed in a collaboration with Santa Cruz as well as its neighbors, Scotts Valley Water District, Soquel Creek Water District, under the leadership of the county, has been the idea of transferring water back and forth.
Right.
And that's really promising in my opinion, because it allows the city to have more access to well water, groundwater, during its drought years. And it also allow those groundwater to get recharged in the wintertime when there's an abundance of water most winters.
I know you have one of the committee members is an at-large community member representing the Soquel Creek Water District users?
Not quite.
No?
They're all members. All the members of the committee live in or representing the Santa Cruz service area.
Okay.
So there's people representing in-city folks and
Right.
people representing outside the city, but still in the water
Right.
district.
So my question would be, because we're all concerned about water regionally, what is Soquel Creek Water District doing now that the desal plant was going to be primarily beneficial for them? Because to recharge their aquifer and to prevent saltwater intrusion, they were going to pump the plant 300 days a year to be able to recharge some of their aquifer. And we were only going to use it for a few days. So although it was a shared cost kind of a thing, and certainly it's a collaborative effort, not having desal available is certainly more of a concern, I would think, for the Soquel Creek Water District folks than it would be for us here as city water users.
Well, the Soquel Creek Water District and their board have a very serious problem on their hands, which is the intrusion of salt water into the aquifer, because they've been overpumping that aquifer for years. Unfortunately, the overpumping occurred because they were getting bad advice from a hydrogeology consultant that said, no, you can keep pumping at this rate and nothing bad's going to happen. Well, that wasn't really true. So now they're in a deficit, and just to get that water level back to safe levels, to the groundwater to rise up to the point to stave off the salt water coming in from the ocean, they have to cut back by over 30% in their water use. Well, what does that 30%, 30+% mean? It means that everyone in the district would have to get down to an average of 53 gallons a day per person. Right. Do you think you could live on that, Steve? Or maybe you already do. I don't know. But the district didn't believe the district didn't believe that that people would be willing to do that, and so that's why they pursue desalination, and that's why now that the collaborative joint desal project has failed, or at least has been put on hold.
Right, of course.
They are looking into other water supply opportunities.
So when you're considering, you're the Water Supply Advisory Committee, and certainly you're considering a supply and demand for city water users over the long term, how does UCSD expansion, university water supply factor into anything that you're considering?
Yeah. Well, the university wants to grow, and their plan for growth is to expand into the forest north of the current campus, right? That in order to get water from the city for that expansion, the university and the city have to go to the LAFCO, which stands for Local Agency Formation Commission. That's the governmental body that approves these kind of boundary expansions. Santa Cruz would be expanding its water service boundary. That's a very controversial request to make at this time, that the university wants more water. They wanted to essentially double their water supply, water consumption.
Are they about 200 million gallons a year, give or take, or something?
Yeah, somewhere around 200, and they were asking for 350. So they were asking at a bad time, because it's apparent that we don't have enough water in drought years to supply that kind of expansion. And we haven't figured out what our solution is going to be. I mean, so the timing was really poor to make a request for that much new water. So LAFCO's proceedings are on hold because the environmental study that was formulated in order to justify this expansion of water service had been found disallowed by the courts.
Yeah.
So now that whole thing is on hold. The university, of course, still wants to grow, but they may have to go into some other directions, like figure out how they're going to grow on their existing footprint.
And to your knowledge, have they looked at other options in terms of water supply rather than it being supplied by the City of Santa Cruz Water Department?
I do know that they have a well that's not being used, quite a productive well that's at the farm.
Right.
And they have re-engaged a hydrogeology company in order to look into what are the impacts of using that well. Will it, for example, dry up the streams that run on Bay Street and Spring Street?
Yeah.
And there are a number of springs that trickle down into Neary Lagoon. So will it dry up those streams or not? So that's what the hydrogeologist is looking into.
Yeah. So you've been together as a committee for a time and have gone through the process of kind of getting your foundations and your footing and what you would like to do for process. Are you reaching now a time when you're going to start making some substantive suggestions to really what we can do for maintaining our future water supply?
Yeah. Well, I wish I knew the answer.
You're allowed to do some speculation.
Yeah. So here's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we come from very diverse. I mean, Mike Rock and I were in debates on this show.
Well, yeah, of course.
And so how is that former disagreement? Might it be an obstacle for us now? I think there are, I can see potential obstacles. For example, when you look at an energy-intensive project such as recycle water, to get wastewater to the level that it could be considered for potable use or for even for agricultural use is expensive. And it's expensive in money, it's expensive in energy, and it has health impacts that are not well understood. There's a sizable group of people within the desal alternatives group that are asking very tough questions about the use of recycled water. I mean, you imagine, the sewer as your water source. You absolutely have to get a perfect score, to be able to consider drinking that.
Right.
If things go wrong, as they sometimes do, then that's kind of scary. So there are people that are asking tough questions, and we haven't had those questions answered yet. So, I'm sure we have some bumpy road ahead of us.
It's interesting when you talk about it's energy intensive, it's expensive, it sounds very much like desal, which were two of the main objections to that.
Kind of deja vu.
Deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
So will there be at some point, now what is your mandate? At some point will you be offering an advisory opinion to the Water Commission that will then go to the City Council, or you're going to advise the City Council directly and then they will take these under advisement in cooperation with the Water Department and Rosemary Menard and those folks? Is that
so the goal is that the committee was set up to advise the City Council. So the goal is that we can get as specific as we can with the knowledge available. We're only going to October, so whatever we know by October is what we got. And so.
Oh, I didn't realize that it sunsets in October?
That's right.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That I did not know.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me. Do we have a call? Hi, you're on with Rick Longinati.
Hey, I'm wondering, what does the desal plant really do to the ocean? Someone told me they takes out a little bit of fresh water and throws back the more salty water. What does that actually do to the ocean, I'm wondering?
Well, thanks. We'll ask.
Yeah. So there are two impacts on the ocean. One is when the water is being sucked out of the ocean in order to being brought into the plant. So everything dies that's sucked into the plant. And that includes, even though they have filters to filter things out, that includes fish larvae, because the larvae are small enough to get through the filters.
Right.
The question was posed during this $15 million worth of studying, is this a significant impact? And the biologists found that the mortality of adult fish would not be significantly affected because basically it's a big ocean and it's not a lot of water. I mean, that was
That was those entrapment and entrainment studies that they
That's
did.
right.
Yeah.
What the caller is asking about is the discharge of the waste from the desalination process, which is a hyper salty
Supersalinated brine. Yeah.
And so anywhere where you have desalination plants around the world, you have that issue because when you put a really salty brine into the ocean, if it is not dispersed really quickly, then any fish that are encountering that will shrivel up and die.
Well, I think the question is a good one because you're still considering amongst the range of options to suggest to City Council. Desal is certainly one of them. And so those kinds of considerations still have to be researched and determined when you're making a decision.
Santa Cruz figured that they had that problem solved about the brine because what they were talking about is mixing that waste from the desalination plant with the sewage outflow from the city, which is not salty. And in the process of heading out to the ocean, those two fluids would mix to a level where the discharge would be at the same level of salinity as the ocean. So they figured that they had that one solved, and maybe that would be the case. In other parts of the state where they're building a plant right now, a desal plant down in San Diego, there's going to be fish mortality for sure on account of that brine.
And while that may be satisfied to their satisfaction, I know that Sarah Manser or somebody like myself who's been a sanctuary steward with Save Our Shores for a number of years still questions the impact on the marine environment, on our sanctuary. And regardless of what they say about entrapment and entrainment, we're not going to lose that many eggs, it's not going to impact the fish population still, and the supersaturated brine being mixed back appropriately and all that stuff. I think environmentalists still look at it and say, is that really going to have the kind of no impact? It's like being carbon free. If something, is it really going to have no impact? And I think that people need to be convinced of that, even if they see the studies. And so I think that's incumbent on anyone who really is thinking about desal anywhere as an option. And we were talking before the show, reverse osmosis was the technology that was considered before we pressed pause on this. And now you say there's a forward osmosis technology that's available.
Well, one of the ideas being submitted by a private company is forward osmosis, and the claim is that it's much less energy intensive than reverse osmosis. The issue with that is that it's not, there's nowhere where it's been implemented, so it's not something that we can jump on.
And I saw, again, when I was looking at the video of the October convention, there's, again, just a range of suggestions people have. But everybody has very good, very well thought out, very well researched suggestions about what we can do, and you hear all of those.
Right, and the committee, we're trying to, how do we pick? How do we pick among these alternatives? So we're trying to agree on a list of criteria. What are the, and so we do have a lot of agreement. How much is it going to cost?
Right.
What's the energy use? Is it feasible?
Right.
Does it contribute to our resilience in our water system? So we've got some good evaluation, but we have differences over what those things mean, and that's where we're at right now. It's kind of, if you were just if you're just studying this from the outside, you might find it fascinating. Sometimes I don't have that. Detachment to find it fascinating.
I know that having gone to the desal task force meetings when they were the run-up for when the water department was going full steam trying to get ready to build a desal plant, there were a lot of different metrics they were using, a lot of different assessment tools, just even to decide what kind of desal alternatives they're going, what kind of things they were going to do. And I think it's maybe similar. Is that a similar process with you? Do you have some kind of an assessment tool where you say, what's the price, what's the energy use, what's the feasibility, how many gallons are going to produce? Are all those things part of the consideration that ultimately will let you rank the suggestions that you make to City Council?
Yeah, just what you said.
Okay, well, I'm delighted that they're doing that.
There is a tool to rank them. I think where we're at in terms of our dynamic as a committee is that we haven't yet had the conversation about these these criteria. So take resilience, for example. Now, if you consider expensive, energy-intensive, water reuse thing, I mean, it's a tragedy that we use water once and it goes in the sewer and we can't use it again. And the tragedy is because sustainability is all about kind of reuse and kind of cycles of water cycle and carbon cycle and all that. Well, there's so much toxic that we put in the sewer that it makes it very, very expensive to try to clean it back up again. We've lost our minds about all the toxics that we allow in our society. So then, what I call tragedy of we can't do the right thing without a super energy intensive and highly high tech engineering solution, and even that is questionable as to whether it's healthy. So I think that what this has taught me is that there's some fundamental ways as a society that we need to kind of safeguard ourselves from these toxins if that kind of solution is going to be viable.
And is that also within kind of your mandate? Can you make broad statements of policy, for instance, like that to the City Council? Say, one of the problems is that our water is so toxic that it takes us too much energy and too much expense to be able to make it potable again.
Well, certainly we can raise that as a reservation.
Yeah.
The other area that I think the committee is not yet united on is this idea of resilience. Now, so if you have a solution like recycled water and you say, yeah, well, it makes the system more resilient, right? Because it adds another component. We're not just dependent on stream flow and a few wells. We got another source. Well, okay, great, more resilience. But for how long?
Right.
How long would that high-tech, high-energy, and expensive operation last? I mean, would you buy a Porsche or a Toyota if you wanted, to have the same car for 20 years and have low maintenance costs? I mean, the question is, are we going to saddle ourselves with a technology that a future generation might not be able to afford? Yeah. And what about energy costs and supplies in the future? Is energy going to be cheap forever?
Right.
Is it going to be available forever in the quantities we have now? If not, what are we giving to our next generation?
Right, of course. Yeah.
We're getting them hooked. We're getting the next generation hooked on high energy. So I think there are deep questions that we have not even talked about yet.
And during your deliberations, does the level of our own local conservation or the effort that's put forth by our water department to make sure that the city has low-flow toilets and does the things that make us more water conservation conscious, are those parts of your deliberations as well when you're factoring that in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because if you had a private company, when would you have a private company who wanted to sell less of their product?
Right. Yeah.
Can you name any?
I can't. Well, let me hold that thought. We got to have a question from the audience here.
I'm John. I'm a cameraman actually here at the TV station, and I have a question. Why can't we sell, or why can't we distribute the salt out through markets or through spas? And because sea salt is supposed to be healthy for your skin and for your digestive, or why can't we just use some of that salt that's going to be taken out, or whatever, and because that could cover some of the cost of the desalination of it, and then we don't have to worry about putting so much more salt into the ocean, and we don't need to put so much more fresh water in with the ocean, where we could keep that water back. And
yeah, I think I understand your question. So
answer that as with your hat on as desal alternatives, or with your hat on as the Water Supply Advisory Committee, or both?
Well, I think I'm more comfortable as desal alternatives.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for others.
All right, good. Yeah.
So I think what he's suggesting is that can you make a little enterprise out of producing salt? I think you would, practically speaking, you would need more evaporation ponds and so on, which require land area that we don't have. it's not been suggested as one of the strategies for bringing the cost down, and frankly, I'm not really interested in strategies to bring the desalination cost down because it still has the problem of high energy use. How do you bring the energy use down?
Right.
Well, we don't have a solution yet.
Right. So I want to get back to the conservation aspect of this because I know that during the period of time when we were talking about the desal alternatives and later about the right to vote in desal, there was always the response from the water department that we're doing everything we can to conserve water. We're doing everything we can to provide people with low flow fixtures, things like that. Are you still being advised by Toby or any of the folks over at the water department about their efforts and whether or not those efforts have expanded or whether they think that they're doing everything they can?
Well, I think it's, as I said, there's no private company would want to sell less of its product, and yet you have a water agency that's selling water, and they're in the business of trying to get people to buy less of it. And what that does to their income is it makes it go down. And that's a miracle that they're able to do that and to encourage conservation. I think that people really ought to appreciate the city's water department for the aggressive water
and something interesting that I learned recently is that we have kind of a fixed rate water department system, is that they have certain fixed costs. And the more water that we conserve, the less water you use, and the less you're paying into the revenue for the water department, the less able they are to maintain those kinds of things. So it's kind of counterintuitive in that way.
Right. Well, there's a whole issue. I mean, the water department does, feel the push-pull. They want people to conserve, and yet they want to pay their staff.
Right. Exactly.
And so sometimes the way they resolve that conflict is not the way I would resolve it. They do have a high fixed charge on everyone's bill. For example, you're a residence and you're using 150 gallons a day or less for your home, say.
I'm not. I barely use any water at all. Just as an aside.
All right. So you come under that 150. So the fixed portion of your bill is larger than the portion of your bill that pays for the water that you use.
Right.
And when we have that kind of rate structure, it doesn't really help people see the results of their conservation. You could cut back by 25% and you wouldn't see your bill go down very much. So a suggestion, and I think the city is actually taking these suggestions very seriously, is that they restructure the rates so that it is more encouraging of conservation.
And that was the subject of a recent city council, was it a special session that they had last Tuesday?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So the city council was giving direction to the staff, and the city council, one of their top priorities for how to design a rate structure is to make it encouraging of conservation. So I was very pleased at the outcome.
I do want to talk a little bit about water neutral development and water transfers and that. Maybe we can get to it, but I do want us to see Scott McGillivery's video, at least part of it, and his Water for Santa Cruz County, which I think is wonderful. But before that, we have another question from the audience.
Hi. I want to ask a question about something you mentioned earlier. I've heard this before. You mentioned that the energy cost for a desal gallon is 10 times that of the current usage. But that always struck me as apples and oranges because you're looking at a fully burdened cost now. You're not looking at the marginal cost to produce an extra gallon. And you brought that up somewhat when you talked about recycling the water, that was also going to be expensive and energy intensive. So my first question would be, how expensive is desal or recycling compared to any other method to get one extra gallon? Not the gallons we have currently, but a new gallon.
How expensive energy-wise or in cost?
Either one, whichever one you
feel. Okay. Well, I'll talk about the energy for a second. So one of the main alternatives that I'm excited about is the idea of sending water from the San Lorenzo River during normal and wet winters to our neighbors. And
water transfers.
Yeah, transferring water. So that's actually an energy savings solution because the amount of electricity that takes to pump water basically not very far and very high is less than the energy to pump water out of the ground. So those neighboring districts are going to be saving electricity by not pumping water out of the ground. They're basically going to be on city water during the winter months of those years. So I like that a whole lot better than the desal, which would be a lot more energy intensive.
Of course, building those pipelines has a huge expense as well.
Yes.
But the second part of my question is, have you also considered that there's a learning curve in any technical solution? And it looks like the amount of energy required to produce a gallon of desal 5-10 years from now is going to be 1/10 what it is today. So I wondered if that's been figured in.
Well, from what I understand, I'm not an engineer, that the reverse osmosis has certain theoretical limits of efficiency, and we're pretty much bumping up against those. So that particular style of desalination is not going to get a lot more energy savings, but there may be other forms of desalination that are down the pike, and I mentioned one of them, which is forward osmosis. You know, it may be in some future years that might be viable from an energy point of view.
I've just seen research that shows that they can drop by 1/10 the cost of a desal gallon. Already there's several filters that can do that. So it's a question of whether you know, it's manufacturable. There's a million questions. Any new idea, just having it doesn't mean that it's going to work. But there is data to suggest that pushing water across the reverse osmosis filter, the energy required is going to drop by about a factor of 10. So.
Well, those are the very things really they think that the Water Supply Advisory Committee is considering, is looking at.
Yeah, you know, and one of the criteria is you know, can we make a recommendation on something that's never been implemented yet?
Yeah.
And I think pretty much everybody agrees that no, we need to at least see it operating somewhere. So, you know, and it's 2015, in another 15 years there'll be another committee that'll figure out. So.
Well, our good friend Scott McGilvery has suggested that there are 500 million gallons of extra water that we can get, and he has this organization, Water for Santa Cruz County. And we have a short video. I'd like to play maybe 5 minutes of that. We're getting toward the end of the show, but I want maybe 5 minutes of that if we could, and then we'll get back and maybe talk a little bit about that.
The excess winter flows in the San Lorenzo River will solve our water issues in the short term and the medium term. In the long term, we want to explore other possibilities.
Working with the Water Department and Soquel Creek, we've applied for a grant to look at the feasibility of using recycled water in the county-wide.
I am a big proponent of reclaimed water.
The state has provided health and safety standards which permit the use of recycled water to include replenishment of rivers, aquifers, ground basins, and reservoirs, in addition to permitted irrigation uses such as golf courses.
Pasatiempo Golf Course is a gem in the Santa Cruz foothills. It was created by Marion Hollins, a Santa Cruz resident. She commissioned Alistair McKenzie, the man who built Augusta National Golf Course. Of all the golf courses Dr. McKenzie built, Pasatiempo was his favorite.
It's been something that Pasatiempo has been working towards for over 10 years. The last 3 superintendents, the last 3 general managers have all been trying to get some type of recycled water here. My previous employment at the Olympic Club in San Francisco, we were on tertiary water. Agronomically, there's some changes that you have to make, but those adjustments can be made and managed well. You know, the infrastructure is in the ground for the most part, and so it's really just coming down to being able to negotiate long-term contract, which is what we're looking for at Pasatiempo, to receive that from the city of Scotts Valley.
Scotts Valley built a water reclamation plant 10 years ago. The city can only use some of the reclaimed water. The rest of the reclaimed water flows in a pipe right past the Pasatiempo Golf Course on its way to disposal in the Monterey Bay. Reclaimed water for Pasatiempo is just the beginning. Santa Cruz has 3 billion gallons of recycled water at the Neary Lagoon. Less than 100 million gallons of that are reused. This water could be treated and sent to the North Coast to water Brussels sprouts or towards Watsonville to be made available to farmers. Some people are wary of this resource. We went and spoke to Ron Dunkervoort at Windmill Farms about his experience using reclaimed water on his organic farm for the last 7 years.
I'm lucky enough that I have the irrigation from Pajaro Valley recycled water coming through my farm here, so I could hook up to them and I'm getting recycled water from Pájaro Valley. I open the valve and it's always there, and it's clean and it's wonderful. It's the way of the future, I think. And I can say so because I'm doing it. I'm not dreaming about that aspect. I'm actually getting it. It's not cheap, but it's water. You pay for that, you know. I farm a little property across the street here, and I think it's probably more expensive than the recycled water at the end. I would have to leave if there was no recycled water on this property. I had to go and look for a new property, and probably farther away from the coast, because it is all getting salinated more and more. And so thanks to the recycled water, I can be here and grow great food.
The hydrologic cycle has been understood for a long time. It is an old concept. The word hydrologic comes from Latin and Greek. In Latin, hydro means water, and in Greek, logos means reason.
It's certainly true that water is in motion throughout the hydrologic cycle, and it has been for billions of years. So water that we see now in the ocean, at some point in the past, it might have been on the top of a mountain. And water that we see in streams now, at some point in the past, might have been in an aquifer. I think what we're learning is that there are benefits to the way the hydrologic cycle operates. People are finding it easier to see and measure and recognize those benefits. The challenge is getting those benefits included in the cost-benefit analysis that people do when they look at various water alternatives. One of the challenges with working with natural systems is they're less predictable than engineered systems. So when you have water behind a dam, as long as there's water there, you can generate the flow at the rate you like. If you're running a desal system, you flip the switch, you turn the knob, you get the water you want. There's a certain appeal to that from an engineering perspective because it can be controlled. When we deal with natural systems or quasi-natural systems like aquifers and rivers that have been influenced by people, we have less control. And developing infrastructure that can handle that can supply enough water, even though we can't control it quite as well, that's the challenge. But the benefit is that we get the hydrologic system services that those aquatic systems provide. And so this is really the tension right now. We're seeing the benefit of keeping these systems operating, of at least partly restoring them to the way they operated before people got involved. That provides a benefit, but it comes at a cost. It might make our water supply a little less reliable, or it might require that we have more people involved in the management, which is a little more complicated. We can look at how the system used to work, and we can recognize that moving towards that direction can be beneficial. And the trick then is to find the places where you can do that at minimal cost and minimal negative impact, and find the most benefit for as many different people and ecological systems as possible. And we don't need to find all of the places, we just need to find a few. That's not going to solve all of the water.
Well, it's a wonderful and informative video from our friend Scott McGilvery. I'm sorry we didn't have an opportunity to play the entire 19 minutes, but you can go on YouTube and take a look at it. Water for Santa Cruz County, I think it's called. It's just terrific. So Scott says, and some of the folks there were talking about the hydrological impact of water and whatnot, that there's 500 million gallons available somewhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, what Dr. Fisher, Andrew Fisher, was talking about, so he's a local hydrogeologist. What he was talking about was kind of like working with nature rather than trying to engineer, some other kind of thing outside of the natural systems. Right. And he said, I think he's got the long view, He's thinking, well, how long can we sustain these expensive, energy-intensive, and high-tech systems?
That you were alluding to earlier, yeah.
If you work with nature, he says, it may be not quite as reliable because it's not just like flipping the switch. Right. But in the long run, that's more sustainable. I would agree with that. So I think what the kinds of things Fisher is talking about is to recharge the aquifers. We have, certainly Pájaro Valley is a terrible problem, one of the worst in the world in terms of saltwater intrusion. We have not quite so bad, but it's still a serious issue in Mid-County, and that's what the Soquel Creek Water District is dealing with, as well as city wells that are on that aquifer. Right. And even in the San Lorenzo Valley, the aquifer underneath the San Lorenzo Valley in certain places is down by 200 feet from historic levels. So I think what I'm hoping the goal of our Water Supply Advisory Committee is to restore those aquifers, to leave a legacy for the next generation that means that their groundwater will be restored to the point where we're not, they're not damaged.
It's interesting.
So I think, in order to do that, and what Fisher is talking about, you need to be creative. Well, how can we restore the aquifers? Well, one idea is to overcome these artificial barriers. Oh, you live in SoCal District and I live across 41st Avenue, and I'm in Santa Cruz District. No, we're not gonna collaborate. No. I mean, because we share an aquifer. You can have some water in the wintertime, Steve. We'll give it to you. For 4 months out of the year, you can be on city water.
I'll take it, and I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, the 1 out of 6 years that we have a serious drought, give some of it back. You don't need to give it all. But so those are the kind of creative solutions. But what is that going to require? It's going to require people getting along and collaborating. And that's another challenge that's different from an engineering challenge.
Well, let me ask you about another potential collaboration, and that is between developers and people who need water, and that is, water neutral development, which is something that you have advocated for a long period of time. Is there some way that developers can be more creative in the way they build or the way that they access water, the things that they do, that they can contribute to the solution rather than being part of the problem?
Sure. I mean, the goal of water neutral development is that growth, the growth that happens every year, it does not erode our water security, because the more water we send to new development out of the reservoir or out of the ground, that depletes those resources. So how can we neutralize growth so that growth could happen, but the impact on the water supply would be neutralized? And the way that we've thought, that other communities are doing around the country and around the state is developers contribute towards conservation measures that offset the increased water use of their project. So that's one way to really encourage. The second goal, really, of that kind of program is to really encourage developers to build water efficient buildings, because they can have relief from this water hookup fee that they're charged. If they build a building that's really water efficient, that goes beyond the existing code, they can get a financial benefit. And that's what we need to be encouraged. We need to be building buildings now that are going to be that don't need to be retrofitted in 20 years.
Are the new revisions of the plumbing codes locally and throughout the state law, is that helping push this agenda forward?
Absolutely. The California code is really progressive in terms of water efficiency. Of course, in 20 years, it'll be even better. And so my question to you is, should we wait for 20 years for Santa Cruz to be better, or should we get a jump on the state and actually do better than the state of California? And I think it's the latter. I hope people would agree.
Well, certainly these are the things that the Water Supply Advisory Committee is really looking at. I'm fascinated by the overall kind of approach to kind of a holistic approach to water supply and our water future, and I think that maybe is on the minds of a lot of people in town. I said we should be using all the things at our disposal to be able to make ourselves more water efficient, but also to be able to generate more of the water that we need, and perhaps that's the direction we're going. I know that over the years, and you and I have talked a lot about what we can do to make Santa Cruz sustainable in its water supply, and meet the demand over the years. And I think that you, as much as anyone, has been engaged in that work. So you have any last thoughts about kind of from where you are sitting now as a member of the Water Supply Advisory Committee to where you'll be, you think, hope to be in October?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our job as citizens, we're lay people in this process of trying to figure out water solutions, right? So I think our job as the lay people is to communicate to the experts, the technical people, what the values of this community are. And the values of this community are that we want to be one of the best water conservation communities around.
Absolutely.
And that we want to have a sustainable, we don't want to go to an energy intensive direction. We want to go the soft energy path, right? So, the experts, they don't know that about Santa. And then there are other projects, those values don't loom so large for them. So we need to communicate with them that that's the local value.
And I think it's interesting in retrospect that desal, one of the things that really made it possible for us to put that on the ballot and have that measure be passed so overwhelmingly, is that desal just didn't reflect our community values. It didn't reflect who Santa Cruz is. You know, Santa Cruz knows that it can do better, you know, in terms of energy conservation and in terms of cost and in terms of, you know, reducing their carbon footprint. They can do all that and still have the water they need. So I think you're right in making the point that, you know, we need to reflect what our community wants, what our community values, you know, in as we go through this process.
Yeah, I think that that's the lesson. You know, I mean, the debate over desalination was contentious at times, you know, controversial. It didn't really need to be, but it was. And, you know, can we learn the lesson of that controversy, which is, I think, that the people need to be in charge of the process in terms of communicating the values.
Very well said. Thank you for summing up. One more time, the two meetings coming up for the Water Supply Advisory Committee?
March 18th, 5 p.m. up at the Peace United Church up on High Street, and Friday the 20th at 2 p.m.
Great. Well, thank you for your work. Always a pleasure to see you, and appreciate all of the good works that you're putting in. And convey our thanks at CTV to all the people on Wasatch, because they're doing a terrific job for the community. Thanks again for tuning in. This has been Voices from the Village. I'm Steve Plage, and for our producer, Charlie and Betsy Phillips, for all the folks in the engineering room, for all the folks behind the cameras, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.